though the last month's related to co-requisite support, and you heard me just talk about it, multiple measures is a strategy that's often connected with co-requisite support for the ways that it enhances that. The way that we've designed it to happen today is we're going to have a combination of research and practice. So my name is Brandon Protas. I am a strategy director here at Complete College America. First, you're going to hear from Elisabeth Barnett. She's from the Community College Research Center. She's led amazing research in the field of multiple measures, and she's going to share that with us today. And then Scott Putorti, he is from Westchester Community College. He's going to be sharing one example of directed self-placement. Directed self-placement is one example of multiple measures. And very often we get the question of, we get it in theory, but we'd like to see it in practice. So today's webinar is really designed to be able to do both, a grounding in theory and then specific examples from one community college who's doing directed self-placement. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Elisabeth Barnett.
Thank you, Brandon. Let me bring up my slides. All right. So welcome, everybody. Very nice to be part of this event today and to share some of what we've been doing and thinking about when it comes to multiple measures assessment and placement. I'm going to give you some background, why we're using multiple measures assessment for placement, why we're suggesting that that's a really good way to go with your placement system, a little information on the national picture, what some of your options are if you're thinking about developing a multiple measures system, and a very brief few minutes on research that we've been doing. If you want to get deeper into the research, please do go to the Community College Research Center website and you'll find a lot more, and do feel free to reach out if you have any questions about that in the future. So multiple measures assessment, what do we mean? Really any system that combines two or more measures to place students into appropriate courses. And we also include supports here. There may be situations where you want to differentiate supports for different students. And when we talk about combining them, it means we're taking more than one into account. It doesn't mean you necessarily have to have a sophisticated system for doing that, although some colleges may want to do that. So who is using measures other than standardized tests for assessment? What we can see is that in 2016, there was a huge amount of growth from 2011. And if we were to look now, almost 5 years later, we would see even more growth, I'm sure, just from what we know of the national scene. But back in 2016, what we had was both community colleges and public four-year colleges, over half were using more than one measure and a measure other than standardized tests for both math and reading and writing. And what measures were they using at that point? And this is again 2016 data. Pretty much everybody was using standardized tests. Now that number has changed a lot over the past year because of the pandemic for the most part. I mean, there's a fair amount of movement away from tests, but before that, a lot of people were adding other measures to the tests they were administering. Because of the pandemic, many testing labs have been closed and many colleges are looking at other measures and, reducing the use of tests pretty substantially. So in addition, other kinds of measures, they were using high school performance, mostly the high school GPA. And throughout this presentation, I'll be making a case that the high school GPA is the measure we have that best predicts success in first college level courses, math and English. Many times colleges were also taking into account students' planned course of study, especially in math, thinking about math pathways and which type of math might be most appropriate for students. And in a few cases, they were using other indicators of motivation or commitment, because we know that it's not just content knowledge that predicts how well you'll do when you get to college. Now, why is this a big deal? Basically because we have so many students. Now this data is a little bit out of date, but I don't think it's changed a whole lot. We have so many students that come into college needing some form of remediation or developmental education. And what we know is that when students enter college, and start in developmental education courses, they're substantially less able to progress and ultimately to graduate. And so what we want to do is make sure that developmental education courses and or co-rec courses are being taken by students who really do need them. Recently, co-rec courses are becoming much more widely available, and we think that that's an important part of the solution when we think about students who are not progressing the way we want them to. So I'm glad that that's also been a topic for these webinars. So as people were becoming concerned about the impact of developmental education on student progression, some of my colleagues at the Community College Research Center, especially Judy Scott Clayton, did some research to look at how effectively single placement tests were predicting success in first college level courses. And she used a pretty high bar. She looked at success with a B or better. So what students could, would be able to pass a college level course with a B or better. And what she did is she compared students' placement just using that exam with placement using a whole lot of indicators that you put together into a model, including their high school performance primarily, but other things like years out of high school and so on. And what she found is that a lot of students were being placed appropriately, meaning the exam placed them in developmental, and according to this more sophisticated model, they would have been in developmental, or same with college level. But she found that there was a particular problem with underplacement. So a substantial number of students were being placed in developmental courses when they could have earned a B or better in college courses. So, in this particular study, 29% of English students and 18% of math. If you used a C or better criteria, you would have even larger numbers. And you also had some problem with overplacement. So students who were placed in college level, it should have been in developmental, but that wasn't coming up a whole lot. So people started thinking pretty seriously about what the alternatives were. And most of the research that came out of the study that I just mentioned, and other research like what we were doing with the State University of New York colleges, we're finding that if you looked at predictors of success in college level courses, you would usually get a profile that looks kind of like these charts here. So this is one particular college, but if you look at most colleges, if you look at their historical data and use it to predict success in college level courses, you get this kind of profile where the high school GPA does, a reasonably good job of predicting. The test by itself does a much poorer job of predicting success in the college level course. If you put GPA and test scores together, so multiple measures, right, you're getting a better prediction. And if you add other, what we call the full model, and that may vary, can vary by college, what you've got available. It could be, years out of high school, type of diploma, you might have non-cognitive measures. But if you use a fuller model, you'll get better results. And what this leads us to believe is, some factors that seem to be relevant pretty much across the board. First of all, the better assessment systems are needed. What we're doing with a single test is just not doing right by students. High school GPA, as I said, is the best predictor, but truthfully, none of these is a great predictor. So we've got to have a certain amount of humility about how much we can really predict. But at the same time, we don't want to be putting students in college into developmental courses unless it really can benefit them. Okay. So what are the options when you want to design a multiple measures system? You have to figure out your measures. You have to decide what system you're going to use to combine them, because as soon as you have more than one measure, you've got to figure out, which first, how do I combine them? What do I do with them? And the third is how you use the results. So just to start with that, placement into traditional courses, college level or developmental, placement into alternative coursework, maybe co-rec. In some cases, it might be other courses, for example, career-related math or, writing for some career area, and then placement into support services. So let's go back to the measures for a moment. So there's a fairly limited number of different things typically available, although people are also coming up with different ideas all the time, and it's important to share those. So there are measures that the college can obtain at the college itself, and then there are measures that have to be obtained from elsewhere, and there are logistical differences there. So at the college, you've got the traditional, mostly the AccuPlacer tests. So there's some college-grown tests. The homegrown tests typically get fairly similar results to the AccuPlacer. Some colleges will use non-cognitive assessments. There are some that use career inventories or computer skills, partly to look at students' plans and directions. Some will use writing assessments. And increasingly with directed self-placement, they'll use questionnaires. And Scott will talk more about how that might work. But in some cases, you could just add questions to the admissions form, or to a test if that's being given. So the other measures mostly come from the high school transcript. And there's a series of questions that colleges have to ask themselves in figuring out how to get the transcript if it's not traditionally provided at the time of admissions. And particularly with community colleges, it's somewhat common that it's not available at that moment. So then how to combine them: decision rules or bands, placement formulas or algorithms, and directed self-placement. And I'm going to give you a little information on each of those in just a moment. But before we do that, let me dig into the high school GPA a little bit, because there are some questions that come up very commonly that I want to address. And I want to give a nod to John Hetz in California and Brad Boston in North Carolina, who did a lot of this thinking and put together some slides, some of which we're going to use here. So these are the things that people are concerned about. First of all, how am I going to get the high school GPA? Secondly, is the high school GPA really better than tests that are out there? Third, how long is it good for? Is it only useful if students are just out of high school? And then last of all, what about different high schools and their norms and their grading systems and so on? So talking about each of those, sources of the high school transcript. So, these are your choices. Your student brings it, the high school sends it over, and sometimes high schools will send a whole batch of transcripts for any students that indicate interest in a particular college. Sometimes it can come from state data systems, or increasingly colleges are accepting self-report. And as you can see on the right side of the screen, there's some research that supports the use of self-report data, that it's generally quite accurate. Some colleges will say, ask for self-report, but then verify. So that's something to consider too. And it's certainly possible to use the 11th grade GPA, which tracks very closely with the 12th grade GPA. So are there tests that are better? This is some research that was done in 2012 in North Carolina, looking at all the tests that were used at different colleges at the time. The final bar on this chart under math and under English is the GPA. And you can see that the GPA was more closely correlated to success in college level courses, or to grades in college level courses, than any of the tests. So we're not going to take too long in this one, but it just gives you a visual, that can help just communicate this, that it's pretty hard to get a test that's better than the GPA. Now, let me just take a moment here and say, one reason for that is that GPA can be considered a multiple measure in itself. It's capturing not just content knowledge, but also, whether you show up, whether you turn in assignments, whether you, follow through and things like that. Okay, so GPA, how long is it good for? This is based on some research in California. And basically what we see is the AccuPlacer is the gray line in each of these charts. And the numbers across the bottom are semesters since high school. So if we look at English, for example, we've got up to 20 semesters out of high school running across the bottom there. And we see how well the high school GPA is predicting success in college level courses. And what you can see there, we see of the 11th grade and the 12th grade are both there, and you can see they're tracking pretty closely. But what you can see there is that, right out of high school, it's doing the best job. By the time you get to like 10 semesters out of high school, it's still doing a pretty good job, and it's still well above that gray line, which is the AccuPlacer. And by the time you get to 20 semesters, it's still better than the AccuPlacer, although it's getting closer. So, you can have confidence going pretty far out that your English, that in English, you're going to be able to use the GPA. In math, the same pattern holds, but it's a little less compelling. So by 14 semesters or so out, you might be getting better results from the AccuPlacer. And let me show one more slide and then stop for a minute for questions. So this is just looking at whether high school grades from different high schools parallel college grades. And for the most part, what they found, looking again in North Carolina across multiple high schools and college districts, that the high school, no matter which high school you went to, your GPA in college was going to be about 0.4 less than it was in high school. It tends to be very consistent across schools. So let me just stop for a minute. Brandon, are there any questions in the chat or anything we should?
Yeah, so I've been answering the questions as we've been going.
Okay.
But I'll mention a couple of them to you. One is, what do you do for adult learners who have a GED instead of a high school transcript?
You're going to have to build that into your decision rules. So there are going to be a number of cases where you don't have everything you need for your ideal system. And then you're going to have to set up, ideally you're looking at your own college data and figuring out, what level of GED in the past has predicted success in college level courses. But yeah, you're going to have to build those kinds of exceptions in. We don't have any, kind of rules about what level of GED performance is predicted.
And another question, I'm going to put sort of two into one. One was, how do you deal with high school, inflated GPAs or concerns of that? But I think you spoke to that by showing the correlations between the predictors of success. So that leads to the next question. If you could explain a little bit more, when you showed that the high school GPA was at 9.9%, what does that really mean when you're talking about the predictive ability of the different measures? What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going all the way back to this for a minute. So that's the amount. So in this particular case, it's the amount of the variation that's explained by the measure you're talking about. So what this is telling me, besides, which predict best, is that none of these are predicting that great, right? Because it's, say in math, our full model is predicting about, just under 15% of all the variation. So yeah, so that's something to keep in mind, that we have to, do the best we can, but not try to oversimplify too much. So to move along, non-cognitive assessments, I just wanted to mention them. There's some out there. You can look on our website for more information if you're interested, but I just want to make sure people know what the different ways of setting up a multiple measure system are. The algorithm example, which is the one we tested with our research in New York, we took historical data from the college. We used it, we put it into a model and used it to predict success in college level courses. And once we had, the model in place, we basically gave the faculty the opportunity to set cut scores where they thought were most appropriate. So it was basically allowing them to say what, if we gave them information like, if we let 50% of the students into college level, we can expect 70% to pass. If we let more in, a few, fewer will pass. So they set the level, the probability of success they thought was most appropriate. So once you look at the historical data, you need to then be able to put those data pieces into your IT system and have them available at the time you need them for placement of students. And it sounds and is somewhat complicated, but it can be figured out. So decision rule example, that's where instead of looking at historical data, you look at the research that's currently out there and come up with a set of rules that you think covers most of the situations you might have. So you might have some exemptions where a student comes in, say with a certain SAT or ACT, and they're automatically placed into college level. And then if they don't have that level, maybe the next thing you do is you look at their high school record. And if they don't have, say, a 2.6, let's say, you have them take an AccuPlacer test. So that's like a bunch of if-then kinds of decisions. And then directed self-placement, which Scott is going to tell you more about, but basically you have a student questionnaire or other data, the student and an advisor have a conversation, and this, with a fair amount of insight from the student into where they think they would be best off, they're placed into college level or non-college level courses. So I just wanted to share a map that was done by one college we worked with in Minnesota, Anoka-Ramsey. And there are many ways of doing this, but this is kind of what I was talking about in terms of working out ahead of time. What kinds of situations you're going to include in your model. This is a simpler one. There's some that are more complicated and deal with more like different levels of math or possible inclusion of student success courses and other kinds of things. But this is what I'm talking about when I talk about coming up with some kind of a decision rule system. Okay, let me just take a minute to share the results of that SUNY project I talked about. It's a 6-year project. We're working on a follow-up report now to look longer term at results. But basically, it was a random assignment study where half the students were placed using whatever the college had usually been doing, in most cases the AccuPlacer, and then half the students were placed using this algorithm, using their historical data. And we also looked at what it took to implement and to pay for these different systems. So at the end, I'm just going to share the data at the end of year 1. At that point, we had just under 13,000 students in our sample, and it included about 14% that never enrolled into college at all. They came and they took a placement test and they didn't enroll. So, that means that our numbers are maybe a little smaller than you might expect. And this is what happened by the end of the first year with those two different groups. The control group is the turquoise and the program group is the gray. So in English, we had 80% of students placing into college level courses based on historical success rates. So it wasn't just kind of, made up. 80% in the program group and 46% in the control group. Now, not all those students took an English class in that first year. But of those who did take it, we did have students, or this is everybody from the sample now. We had 34% in the program group that took it and completed it in the first year, as opposed to, or in the first term, as opposed to 24%. And, by the end of a first year, there was a slightly smaller difference, but we still had a significantly greater number of students who had completed that first college level English, which is, an important milestone on the road to completing a degree. In math, we had a similar pattern, but smaller effects. So partly due to faculty choices as to where to set those cut scores, we had more students placing into college level math than in the program group than in the control group. At the end of the first term, we had more students who had finished their college level math. And that was still true at the end of a year, although the difference was not enough to be significant. So from other research, we would posit that, if the cut scores had been set differently, we probably would have seen more students completing math in the program group. So just final thoughts, time to move beyond a single placement test. GPA is a good predictor. When in doubt, we have enough research now to think that putting students into college level courses is a good idea for anybody that might be kind of in that marginal area, and especially when there's extra help available, as in with co-recs. And finally, that it takes a while to do a good job of planning these systems. So, making sure that it's been done thoughtfully and including all important stakeholders is really a good idea. So.
Well, I want to thank you, Elisabeth, so much. You put your contact information up there to give that background and the foundation in terms of the theory behind it. I want to, for sake of time, we're going to shift to Scott, because a lot of times we get the question, okay, now we understand it, but what does this actually look like in practice? And so Scott is going to show us one example from a college of directed self-placement. And Scott, if you want to share your screen, we'll let you take it over from here.
All right. Thank you so much, Brandon. Thank you so much, Elisabeth. So my name is Scott Putorti. I'm the coordinator of testing and assessment at Westchester Community College, located in New York. And first thing I want to emphasize is I'm not a researcher. I do not consider myself an expert or a leader in this topic. I probably am, like many of you listening right now, I'm a practitioner at an institution that is really trying to do the best we can for our students in a very difficult and challenging time that we're all kind of facing. So that being said, I do think we have quite the interesting story, and I might be biased towards that. And I hope it can provide all of you some really helpful context in your own discussions regarding placement. So the first thing I want to talk about is a little about the history of placement at WCC. And as you can see from this slide, we have done quite a bit in a short time. It's kept me busy. So prior to 2016, we were a school that relied on a single measure placement exam, and we did use AccuPlacer and a homegrown essay. And this was essentially given to all of our incoming students for placement into their reading, English, and math courses. Starting in 2016, we actually were very lucky enough to be a participant in the CAPA study that Elisabeth was showing some wonderful data from. And in this study, as she had mentioned, it was actually an algorithm that had combined a number of factors, GPA, AccuPlacer scores, and other inputs that determine a student's placement. So after the end of the questionnaire, and it was about 2019, as an institution, we had to make a decision on how to move forward. And you know, there was no doubt, I can say that we became believers in the power of multiple measures. We saw it. But we ultimately did decide to end the use of the algorithm. And this was actually for a number of reasons. Mainly, the algorithm we were using was programmed on the classic AccuPlacer scores. And at this time, College Board actually had transitioned from classic to next generation. And when that happened, we can no longer use that input as one of the factors. And another reason is using an algorithm does make a conversation with a student and a counselor challenging. You know, why was I placed in this class? And it's kind of a nebulous conversation. So, you know, we thought about it and decided we were going to move on from that. And what we did was we essentially created a multiple measure system that is in essence a waiver system. So students meeting certain requirements on exams such as SAT, ACT, our New York State Regents exams. And we also used overall high school GPA, are deemed college ready. And if the students didn't have that information or they did not meet those waivers, we did have them take our traditional placement exam. And I will say that was a fair number of our students still did take AccuPlacer or SI. And of course, though, as we all had to deal with, when the COVID pandemic hit, we kind of had again pivot and reevaluate how were we doing placement at the college. And I can tell you, it was not an easy conversation. It was one that was, we weighed a lot of different options, a lot of pros and cons. And we ultimately did end up using a directed self-placement system. And I will say, I don't know if we would have used it if it wasn't due to COVID. So, you know, prior to COVID, this was not on the table. But when we did explore those options, it's what jumped out to us as being the best for us. So really quickly, this is just a little data regarding college level placement into college level courses. The yellow line up top is our college level placement into English courses, and the red line is college level placement into mathematics. So you can see in 2015, where we started as a single measure school, we had about 50% of students placing into college level classes. And remember, that means 50% of students placing in developmental classes. When we then joined the CAPA study, you will immediately see we had a huge jump in placement regarding our English. And math is kind of an interesting story. It actually kind of dipped down over time. It kind of did pick back up a little. And then in 2019, when we switched over to our waivers, again, English stayed about where it was, and we actually had a 7% increase in placement for our math. So we saw a bump there, and that leads to where we are now, which is directed self-placement. And we just had some data coming back from this, which is regarding the placement numbers. And you will see we did have big jumps in college level placement across the board using directed self-placement. Now, I'm sure everybody's asking the big question, well, how did the students do? Unfortunately, in this presentation, I will not be able to share that just yet. Our IR department, who I ask every single day, is working very hard on that, and they're doing a really fantastic job looking at a lot of different questions that I have, that our faculty have, to really see, is this working and the students are being successful. All right, so what is directed self-placement? So we use the following definition, which says the goal of directed self-placement is to help students integrate self-analysis with data and course expectations consistent with the goal of optimizing student investment, experience, and resolve in determining their course placement. So this definition was introduced by the Academic Senate for California Community Colleges, which is honestly where I did a lot of my own research when I was learning about directed self-placement and I was sharing with our faculty. They've been doing this for quite a while. So to me, directed self-placement is a holistic approach that evaluates a student based on data and self-assessment of their own ability. So much like multiple measures, what I kind of found, there is no cookie cutter approach, right? Elisabeth had just shown you there's many ways to do this, and that is the same thing for directed self-placement. It really did vary from institution into institution how they did it. So I would recommend, it's very important to keep the needs of your institution and the needs of your students at the forefront. And when we did this, we did not reinvent the wheel. We kind of took what other institutions were having success with, and we developed it to meet our own unique needs at Westchester. All right, so one extremely important part of our story was how we were able to quickly put together all these changes in a very short time, right? The pandemic hit, I stopped placement testing, and without placement testing, you don't have an enrollment. So of course, the question said, Scott, what are you gonna do? And we were able to get this up and running in, I would say, about 2 months. But to do this, we leveraged what we had already learned from our participation and the multiple measure study. So we already had structures in place that allowed for a lot of collaboration between different areas from multiple perspectives. We talked to the academic folks, we talked to advising, we thought about the operational viewpoints. And if I really had to stress one thing when you develop your own directed self-placement or your own multiple measure tool, it's really this: communication, teamwork, and make decisions on data. All right. Some of the areas that were really important for us in this teamwork, in this conversation, included faculty. This included the departments we did placement testing for, the academic deans, and our wonderful provost. But it also included input from other areas: counseling, IR, admissions, our enrollment management team. How is this going to be wrapped up in onboarding? And of course, I think it was mentioned already, IT. If you're not, really honestly, become best friends with your IT department, because in any of these systems to work effectively and efficiently, there has to be some automation. So for us, IT department really did a great job with automating a lot of the work that would have been manual. So as I said, this is really a collaborative effort. So next, I kind of want to go into the basics at what directed self-placement entails at Westchester. And I just want to, again, kind of emphasize, this is what we're doing. It doesn't have to be what you do, but I think it's important for you guys to kind of see and think about the questions that we discussed when we were kind of going over this. So again, I want to stress, for us, directed self-placement is not an exam in the traditional sense. We're not asking students to solve quadratic equations, as much as I might really enjoy that. I'm an adjunct math professor. Or we are not asking them to write an essay. So what are we then asking them to do? Well, to us, the directed self-placement is really a holistic approach to placement. And to me, one of the biggest selling points about this is we could take what we learned from multiple measures and combine that student's academic history with other measures, with comfort level with course content, with their motivation, with their study habits. And you could really kind of pick what you think would really be insightful into a student's success in a certain class and combine that into really a single instrument, which is these questionnaires, which I will demo very shortly. And another thing about this is I really do think it makes the student an active participant in their placement. They are invested. And when they have that conversation with the counselor, they've already started to think about a lot of these questions about being successful in a college level course. So one thing about our directed self-placement, all data we collect is self-reported directly by the student. And I know Elisabeth had shown that slide before. So we are relying on students being, truthful and honest when they do report that. Our directed self-placement questionnaire automatically generates a placement based on a student's responses, and the results are immediate. And I will say this is actually a much different approach when you compare this to directed self-placement, or guided self-placement is another name it's commonly gone by. Usually students then have a conversation and pick what course they want to go into. That's not the case on how we do it at Westchester. The questionnaire is actually scored behind the scenes, and how they answer these questions, it actually generates a placement. And then they discuss that placement with a counselor afterwards to make sure it's a right fit. So after completing the directed self-placement and receiving the results, students then meet with a counselor to review their results. And really, honestly, this advisement is key in a system like directed self-placement. They have to be able to have the conversation to really understand the expectations of what is going to happen in that class, and are they ready for that? All right, so once we made the decision to use directed self-placement, we kind of began the process of actually designing these questionnaires, which as I said, I'm going to demo for everybody. So again, a very collaborative effort. It was the testing center, it was the faculty, really the departments we were testing for, they really led the charge with this. Academic deans, counseling, there was a lot of input that was put into this from different areas. And we ultimately ended up with 2 different questionnaires, one that contains placement for English, ESL, or reading, and another just for mathematics. So we built this using Qualtrics, which is chiefly a survey tool, but it allows for a lot of customization behind the scenes that we really were drawn to and kind of figured this is what's going to work for us. And I will say the surveys we've made are pretty intense. That, you know, you need a level of expertise to build this, and we were lucky at Westchester to have a colleague in the IR department who really had a strong background in this. And they were able to really lead the charge in actually the building. I called him the Qualtrics wizard. But you know, that's the one kind of downside. If you are making something a bit more complex, you need that knowledge. So the questionnaire makes extensive use of branching logic. And what it does is it only gives students questions that are relevant to them at the time and depending on how they answered a previous question. And there's also scoring going on behind the scenes that automatically generates a placement for students based on how they responded. So you kind of think about the questionnaire as being separated into 3 different sections. The first and the shortest section is the academic block. And this is where we basically first ask for some demographic information on the student. And then we also find out, is the student actually eligible for this questionnaire? And if so, what parts are they actually eligible for? And again, this is really making use of the branching logic that Qualtrics lets you do. The second section is the academic block. And this is really where we integrated our work on multiple measures into the questionnaires. So we asked them to self-report their high school GPA, their course grades, their standardized exam scores. And lastly, the final section is the questionnaire block. And this question has a wide range of questions which were created by each academic department, asking students about their comfort level with course content, topics that they may see and college level courses. And it also includes some other things. It includes non-cognitive questions, questions about study time, about management skills. And that is the part that is graded behind the scenes, and based on a student's response, how they answered, it will then generate a placement for that student. So once they get that placement, the questionnaire then gives them some information on their next steps, which is to go see a counselor and really talk about just what you went through. So next, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to quickly share and show everybody a demo of the questionnaires that we've actually created. All right, so I know we are short on time, so I'm going to do this pretty quickly, but I offer this to everybody. A lot of the research I did was me reaching out to schools and bothering people. And if you are interested in this, if you want more information, please, my information will be at the end of this presentation. Reach out to me. I kind of want to pay it forward. We learn from each other. So I would be happy to go in more detail because, again, this is going to just be a cursory look at this. So these questionnaires are sent out to all of our students via email. And when they open this, it then gives them some directions, it welcomes them and kind of gives them the idea of what they're going to need. Referring to multiple measures again, we do ask if they have their SAT, ACT Regent scores, they should sit down with those. If they don't have them, it's completely okay. They could still complete this questionnaire and receive a placement. We then ask them to answer this honestly. We ask them to report everything as well as they can, to think about the responses carefully. And then we also provide them some information. If they have any questions, who do they reach out to? If English is not their first language, here's a contact information for our ESL program. So after this, this is then where the eligibility block begins. You'll see here it says hello exclamation mark. This is actually piped in with the student's name, including the student ID of that student. And we ask them to fill out some demographics information. And this is really important for my office. We use this to make sure that everything is correct for the student, the results are going to the right person. And if we have any questions, we can always refer back to this. From there, we then decide, all right, what portion of the directed self-placement should you be going to? This is still the eligibility block. So for example, a student says, I will not have a US high school degree or a GED at the time I begin at WCC. They're a non-high school graduate. Well, in that case, they actually shouldn't be taking directed self-placement. We have a different process for them. So if they were to select this, it branches them using that logic, and it says, it closes down in the questionnaire and says, well, thank you for participating. This is actually not what you need to do, and gives them directions for the next steps. Well, what about students that might not have academic information like SAT scores or GPA? They might have a GED or they might have a foreign high school degree. Well, in that case, if they select this, we assume that they're not going to most likely have the academic information that we're going to ask them, Regent scores, SAT scores, as I said. So what it will do is it skips the academic block and puts them directly into the questionnaire block, which was created by the departments, and asks all those questions about content, level of comfort in these types of classes, things of that nature. Most of our students, though, are US high school graduate degree students, so I will select that. And now it's going to ask, okay, well, when did you graduate high school? And I know Elisabeth showed that fun little slide kind of saying, hey, how well does GPA last? And you might ask, where did I get 10 years from? Well, there it was. So if a student, though, graduated more than 10 years ago, again, the academic information might not be as relevant. So this will push them directly into the questionnaire block. Now, as I said, we do have a lot of new students coming in, so I'll select that. And now this is the academic block. This is where we start to ask questions about GPA, about Regent scores. And how this works is it's connected to our previous multiple measures we were doing prior to the pandemic. If a student selects, and this is self-reported, a score that places them into a college level class using multiple measures, they will receive that placement. So for example, though, I'm going to select that I had it lower than a B. Then it's going to ask, how long ago did I graduate high school? Was it in the past 3 years? And this is connected to our Regents exams, which has a 3-year limitation. And then it's going to say, okay, did you take the Regents exam? Yes, I did take the Regents exam. It's going to ask, well, which ones did you take? Well, I took Algebra 1. And then it's going to say, what is that score? And again, connected to our multiple measures. Let's say, you know what, I didn't do that well in high school, even though I'm teaching math now. I struggled then, so I got a 63. And then it's going to say, okay, well, what about your SAT scores? And essentially, it's going to go through each of our multiple measures to kind of see if the students indicate they meet any of these markers. So I'm going to say, you know what, because of the pandemic, we didn't have SATs this year. What about ACT? Commonly not, usually not used as much in New York. So no, I never took the ACT. And then it says, okay, you did not meet any of our multiple measures, and now you're going to be put into the directed self-placement block. So this was created by the departments with input from other areas. And now these are all scored behind the scenes. And there's a lot of conversation about that and a lot of thought about how to score those and where to place them. And we really relied on the experts of our departments to do this. So some of the questions is, how many years in high school math did you complete? What was the highest level math class you went up to? And again, I'm going to do this very quickly. If you have questions, or even if you would like to try this, I could send you links of samples so you could actually do this on your own. It then asks questions about your experience in math classes. Were you a strong student? Did you struggle? And then we get into some non-cognitive questions, right? We're asking, when you do math problems, are you able to keep track of your progress and understand how you're doing? This is asking, when you're given something new, are you confident with it? And then from there, we start to ask some content questions. But as you could tell, we're not asking students to actually solve this, right? We are saying, here's some questions you would see basically in our arithmetic, our lowest level developmental class. How do you feel with this? Do you think you could solve one of these? Do you think you could solve 2, 3, 4? And students will be able to respond to this, and maybe this one says I could do 2 to 3. That's what I feel comfortable with. And then we go to my favorite, algebra, but maybe this is a little harder for the student and they only select that they could do 1. And then they receive a placement, and then we provide them what courses they could actually place into. It's a pretty quick process, as you can see. And then from there, we will give them their next steps, which is to meet with a counselor. And I can't stress enough, this next step is very important, because this is where they're actually going to have that one-on-one talk. Is this the right fit for me? Let's kind of look over it and make sure you're going to a class that you're going to be successful in. And that was my quick little demo. And I have a few more minutes, so let me just jump back in. But Brandon, are there any questions at this point?
Actually, we only have just another minute or two. We're actually over a little bit, but we're going to extend this because information is great. There is a request for the links that you offered. So I'm assuming that's both to your email, but also where people can do the demonstration themselves, because this is so powerful. So please do take a few more minutes to finish up.
All right, thank you, Brandon. I appreciate it. I'll do this quickly. So, being on the operational side myself, one thing and Elisabeth mentioned this, if you're implementing multiple measures, if you're implementing directed self-placement, you really have to put just as much planning in the operational piece. How is it done? Who's doing it? And always keep the students in mind, right? When you're doing this in onboarding, you want this to be student friendly. If you're making them jump through hoops, is that really helping the student? Is it helping your institution? Who's monitoring this? Is it one office? Is it multiple offices? And please, if you do have an office monitoring, involve them early in the process when you're developing this. Again, to me, academic counseling is connected to this. So how do you connect the two to have a very fruitful conversation and they build off each other? And what about if a student says, you know what, I don't believe in this directed self-placement. I was placed in developmental courses. I answered honestly, but it says I belong here. Can I challenge it? So those are other things. Are there other avenues that student could then explore to get placed into a college level course? I also recommend, if you just want to see how it's laid out for my students, I provided a link at the bottom of this page, and you can refer to that, and you can kind of see information on how students request it. That's all located there. And early outcomes. So, I'm going to do this very quick, but one thing we noticed was placement into our lowest level developmental classes across the board have been down dramatically. And you're probably saying, well, how are students doing in these classes? And trust me, I am just as eager as all of you. And I know very shortly, they're going to be presenting that data to us. And I'm very excited to see how this turned out. And, one thing we knew going into this was, there wasn't a lot of research on directed self-placement. We took a chance, and that's why it's so important we do everything else we can as an institution to support students in these classes: academic support, tutoring, help, counseling, all those things we're trying to exemplify to get students the help they need in these courses. One outcome I do want to mention that I'm very curious about is equity outcomes. There is some research from other states that do directed self-placement that say certain equity groups, certain gender groups might actually evaluate themselves into lower classes based on stereotypes and bias and things of that nature. So that's on our radar, and it's definitely going to be something we look at. And the question is, if it is affecting these students, how can we fix that? And lastly, as I said, we plan to remain agile. We're not just going to stop here and say we are done. We are continually improving this and going to look at the data we get back and say, what do we have to do to make this better? Or is this not working? Should we go back and do something else? We are always willing to change if that's what the data says we need to do. And lastly, very quickly, some reflections: research. As I said, I bothered a lot of schools. Reach out to schools where you find something that you say that might work for us. Learn how they do it. Use existing research and resources. Elisabeth just provided an unbelievable amount. Refer to that. There's a lot out there that could help you make these decisions. Have an existing team to address issues, and it should be a very collaborative team across multiple disciplines and multiple areas. And lastly, as I said, there's really no right way. As I said, this is not baking, right? Baking is a science. This is more cooking. Yes, there's best ingredients to really make a good dish, but there's different ways you could put it together to still make something really tasty. So I hope this was helpful, and thank you very much. And for my email, everybody, that is located right here, and I'll throw this in chat as well.
Thank you, Scott, for putting that in the chat. I did put the link to your testing center website in the chat as well. I think that's the correct one. If there's not, if there's another one, you can drop that in as well. Scott, Elisabeth, I was so excited to have you present on today's webinar on multiple measures and the directed self-placement example. I can tell you from the chat and the Q&A, there was a lot of excitement. So thank you everyone for staying on. We went a little bit over, but I think it was well needed. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me. I'm at bprotas@completecollege.org, and we would like to invite you to come back in 2 weeks. Our next CCA live webinar is going to be on active academic support. That's on April 22nd at 3 o'clock Eastern time. So thank you everyone for attending, and big thank you to Elisabeth and Scott.